Hello, my name is Jillian Crouch, and today I will be talking to you about the mystery of Marilyn Monroe's death. Now, all of you should have a packet which includes my thesis and organizing statement and presentation outline, just in case you may get a little lost during this presentation, because it can get pretty confusing. Now, before we get into the presentation, I have a question for all of you. How many of you actually know who Marilyn Monroe was, other than just hearing your name by a show of hands? Okay, that's more than I thought. If you didn't raise your hand, you ought to be ashamed. Marilyn Monroe was the icon of the 20th century. She had a very successful acting and modeling career. The amount of respect that people have for her is absolutely overwhelming. And I really believe that our generation today has lost that sense of respect because they don't really know who she is. So in order to get a better understanding of what it was like to be friends with Marilyn Monroe, here is a video of her friend Burt Reynolds talking about their friendship.
You knew when you were very young and you were getting started in the business, you were in an acting class with Marilyn Monroe, is that true?
Yes, it's true.
Did you hang out with her at all?
I walked her from 58th Street to the actor studio, and she didn't say much, but she didn't have to. And walking along, and I said, you know, this is amazing, Marilyn, because nobody's, you know, falling apart here because you're walking along.
People weren't recognizing her?
No, they didn't recognize her. I said, wow, how come they don't jump up and down? And she said, oh, do you want to see her? I went, sure. And so all she did was just to throw her shoulders back, you know. I tried that all the time, nothing happened. Like that. And she started walking along within 20 feet. It was surrounded by about 40 people.
Wow. So she could become Marilyn Monroe.
Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I liked her so much. I liked her because she was so real and sweet and kind, all those things. Mm-hmm. Besides being gorgeous.
Yeah.
And a few other things.
Although Marilyn Monroe is best known for her beauty and fame, her death is very infamous. For over 5 decades, her death has been surrounded by conspiracy theories. So what really happened to Marilyn Monroe? Well, that is something that we're never going to know. And we can all make up our own theories. But what we do know for a fact is that Dr. Thomas Noguchi ruled her death a probable suicide. Although her death was ruled a probable suicide, her secret love affairs, the lack of reliable indications of a suicide, and the eyewitness accounts of her death all point to the alternate probability that Marilyn Monroe was murdered.
August the 5th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe is found dead in her Los Angeles home. The coroner decides that it was probable suicide. The verdict seemed plausible. Hollywood's most glamorous star was known as a party girl and a drug user. But right from the start, the verdict has been questioned. Recently, an old rumor has found new life. The claim that on the last night of her life, she had a confrontation with a man the official reports have never mentioned.
He said, you know, you better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. I know what's good for me. I'm Marilyn Monroe.
She was screaming, get out, get out. She didn't want to see him again. Her world was really beginning to unravel that night.
The violent confrontation ends with Marilyn's murder. If true, these events destroy the reputation of one of the most revered politicians of his generation.
Was he capable of murdering Marilyn Monroe or being complicit with it? That's a major allegation. It's shocking.
Now, missing evidence from lost tapes and eyewitness interviews tell a very different story of the death of Marilyn Monroe.
Before we examine any evidence regarding this case, we must first understand Marilyn's secret love affairs that she had with 3 different men. So first, let's take a look at her affair with Dr. Ralph Greenson. Dr. Ralph Greenson was Marilyn's psychiatrist, and he seemed to be really fond of her, so much that people thought it was odd, and it almost seemed like he was in love with her. Marilyn Monroe even stayed as a guest in his home on numerous occasions. Now, after she died, he was asked about that, and he said that Marilyn was a friend of his wife, so when she stayed there, she was a guest of his wife. And Dr. Greenson's wife was also questioned about the affair between them two, and she said that she had no idea it had ever happened. Now, secondly, let's take a look at her affair with President John F. Kennedy, and you probably are already aware of this affair if you know enough about Marilyn Monroe. The rumors about their affair came to life when Marilyn Monroe sang happy birthday to him for his 45th birthday celebration at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962. After President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, people came forward to say that this affair actually did occur. Although their affair seemed more like a fling, it became known that these two met up at least 4 times between the months of October 1961 to August 1962. It is believed that their only sexual encounter took place at Bing Crosby's house on March 24, 1962. Now finally, let's take a look at her affair with Robert F. Kennedy, also known as Bobby Kennedy, and he was President John F. Kennedy's brother. There is no question that Monroe and Bobby were involved in some way. They saw each other several times throughout the week and talked on the phone almost daily. Marilyn even announced that she was head over heels in love with Bobby and that he had promised to marry her soon. When confronted about this affair, Bobby Kennedy denied it every time. However, after the Kennedys died, people also came forward to say that this affair actually did happen too. On the day of Marilyn's death, Bobby Kennedy claimed that he was out of town on business. However, strong evidence puts him in Marilyn's house just hours before she was found dead, not just once, but twice. Apparently, that night there was some sort of confrontation between the two, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Although it is possible that these secret love affairs that Marilyn was involved in could have possibly led to her death, the lack of reliable indications of a suicide creates an even stronger case for probable murder. First, let's talk about the tapes. Ray Straight, who was a witness in the documentary, The Missing Evidence, The Death of Marilyn Monroe, says that Marilyn's house was bugged by secret devices and that he has heard the recorded tapes from them. Although these tapes are missing today, Straight remembers every detail from the recordings on the day that Marilyn died. His story goes like this. He said that he heard Robert F. Kennedy arrive to Marilyn's home on the tapes, and at first they seemed to be having a good time and were probably just having a drink or two, until what Bobby Kennedy said next turned Marilyn's world completely upside down. He said that he had to leave her because too many people were becoming suspicious of their affair. And this sent Marilyn into an outrage because the man that she thought she was going to marry was leaving her. She then threatened Bobby by saying that she was going to hold a press conference to leak the details of the suffrage that she had dealt with at the hands of the Kennedys, including the affairs she had with both of them. Robert F. Kennedy said to her, "You better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." And she responded to him by saying, "I know what's good for me. I'm Marilyn Monroe." You probably recognize these quotations from the second video that I played for you. The older man in the blue suit who was quoting them is Ray Straight. And then Bobby and Marilyn continued to argue, and then finally she screamed at him to get out of her house. He left, but he decided to return later that night, and he wasn't alone. he brought along one of his personal bodyguards. They let themselves into her home and went into her guest cottage to search for her exclusive red diary, which contained all the details of the affairs. Of course, Marilyn found them ransacking her home, and another heated argument arose between the two. On the tapes, Ray Strait says he heard Bobby Kennedy say, "Give her something to calm her down." It is assumed that they sedated her with drugs after, and Strait said that he could hear the sound of what it sounded like her being smothered. Along with these missing tapes that incriminate Robert F. Kennedy for being in town on the day that Marilyn died, the evidence from the crime scene does not really add up. First, the police officers were a bit suspicious because Marilyn's death scene seemed to be staged. Her body was in a perfect line on the bed, face down, and she was grasping a phone in her right hand. It looked like an acting scene from a movie. That's how weird it was. Secondly, in an original police report, Marilyn's housekeeper, who we're going to talk more about later, said that she had called Marilyn's psychiatrist to come over because she was worried about Marilyn's state. When Greenson arrived, he could see Marilyn's lifeless body through an outside window, so he broke into her room from the outside of the window. However, the police officers found the shards of glass outside the home rather than inside the room where they would have logically fallen if the window was broken from the outside. So was the window broken from the inside during a struggle? Lastly, there was an empty bottle of sleeping pills found next to her body. But where was the water that she would have swallowed them with? Of course, it is possible that she took these pills without water, but this was not the first time that Marilyn had attempted suicide. When Marilyn had attempted before, she had water and pills. While using the water, she gagged on just trying to flush down a few pills. So could Marilyn have really taken a whole bottle of pills without any water? Now let's take a look at the autopsy report. As I said earlier, Dr. Thomas Noguchi ruled it a probable suicide, but some of it just does not add up. For instance, there was no residue of the pills found in her digestive system, but there was a lethal amount of drugs found in her blood and liver test. If she had taken these pills, residue would have been found in her digestive system. And a couple weeks after Dr. Thomas Noguchi had examined her body, he began to have second thoughts. So he decided to return to the toxicology lab to have all of Marilyn's organs tested. However, he was shocked to learn that these organs had been thrown out. And if you were to ask him today, he would say that he regretted not having all of her organs tested in the first place. Thus far, we have looked at some interesting pieces of evidence regarding this case. But the strongest by far are the eyewitness accounts of Marilyn's murder. First, let's look at Eunice Murray. Eunice Murray was Marilyn's housekeeper. In an original police report, she had claimed around 10 p.m. she could see a light on under Marilyn's door. But she just blew it off and she didn't think anything of it. But hours later, the light was still on and the door was locked, so she became extremely worried. So she called Dr. Ralph Greenson to come over. And when he got there, as I said earlier, he could see her lifeless body through an outside window and broke in from the outside to her room. And they found her dead and they reported it to the local police department. In 1985, Murray was approached to be a witness in the BBC investigation on the tragedy of Monroe's death. When asked, she told the same version of events that she had told back in 1962. Then, as she thought that the camera crew was already shut down, she said, "Why at my age do I still have to cover up this thing?" When they asked her what she meant, she admitted to Bobby Kennedy being at Marilyn's home the day that she died. She also claimed that an ambulance had arrived to the scene hours before Marilyn's death was officially reported to the police department. They asked her why she never told the truth before. And she said, "I told whatever I thought was good to tell." Now, secondly, let's take a look at James Hall's story. James Hall was the ambulance worker who was called to the crime scene hours before Marilyn's death had been officially reported to the police department. In 1982, Hall was finally presented with her autopsy report, and he began to really believe that he had witnessed the murder of Marilyn Monroe. His story goes like this. He arrived to the scene that night, and he found Marilyn on the floor of her guest cottage, unconscious, but she was still alive. He began to try to resuscitate her, and color started to come back to her face like she was reviving. Then Dr. Ralph Greenson arrived, and this was hours before anyone had ever said he was even at the crime scene. So he pushed Hall aside and he decided to take over. He pulled out a hypodermic syringe with a large heart needle, and Hall just assumed that it was full of adrenaline that was going to revive Marilyn. Then Greenson stuck the needle in her chest, but it went in at an angle. According to Hall, this was the wrong way to do this. So he thought Greenson would just pull the needle out and re-administer the shot in the correct way. However, Hall's hopes for Marilyn were shut down when Greenson leaned on the needle and just shoved it right into her heart. This ended up breaking one of Marilyn's ribs in the process. Within a few minutes, Hall said Marilyn was dead. And when James Hall first revealed these shocking allegations, no one believed him because he was known to be a liar and attention seeker. After taking 14 polygraph tests and passing them all, people started taking him seriously. He was the only eyewitness to take any sort of polygraph test. And although a couple times the results came back inconclusive, this is still a huge lead in the probable murder case. Lastly, but not least, let's take a look at Peter Lawford's confession. Peter Lawford was a famous actor who was a friend of Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. In 1983, he finally decided to come forward to tell his version of events. He claimed that he was well aware of the affairs that she had had with all three men, as I mentioned before. He also said he has heard the missing tapes that Ray Straight has also claimed to hear. On the day that Marilyn died, he had witnessed the confrontation between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. And when they were leaving her house the first time, he recalls Bobby Kennedy on the phone with Dr. Greenson, and he said, "Marilyn has got to be silenced." He also remembered that Bobby convinced Greenson that Marilyn had also threatened to leak their affair to the public. And this was not true, because Marilyn had only threatened to leak the affairs with the Kennedys. Lawford then admitted to being a co-conspirator in the plan to murder Marilyn Monroe with Dr. Greenson and Bobby Kennedy. And a year after telling his story, Peter Lawford was dead. Throughout this presentation, you have heard the many different stories and pieces of evidence regarding Marilyn's death. I covered her love affairs that started with Dr. Ralph Greenson, who was Marilyn's psychiatrist. Then I talked about her affair with President JFK, which seemed to be just a fling. Then I ended with Bobby Kennedy, which seemed like a more serious affair. Then I went on to my second point, which was the evidence that pointed to probable murder rather than probable suicide. I started with the missing tapes that incriminate Bobby Kennedy for being in town the day that Marilyn died. Then to the evidence at the crime scene, which seemed out of place. And then I ended with the strange autopsy report. Finally, I went on to my last and strongest point, which was the eyewitness accounts of Marilyn's death. I talked about Eunice Murray, who changed her story several times, but in 1985, she gave insight to the truth. Then I went on to James Hall, who supposedly watched the murder of Marilyn Monroe. I ended with the strongest of them all, which was Peter Lawford, who admitted to being a co-conspirator in the plan to murder Marilyn Monroe. According to the evidence, it is more than likely true that Marilyn Monroe was probably murdered because of her secret love affairs with three very important men, the evidence that pointed to murder rather than suicide, and the stories of three different witnesses regarding her death. Now, before we're done, I want to take a poll. So, you want to come? So, if you think that she still committed suicide after this presentation, would you please raise your hand? If you think she was murdered, would you please raise your hand? And this is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "Respect is one of life's greatest treasures." I mean, what does it all add up to if you don't have that? Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, Tristan?
You addressed many different stories and conspiracy theories, and your point was that probable murder is a better claim than suicide. But which story do you believe to be true, and who do you think would have committed the murder?
I don't think I've really set myself on a specific story to be right. I do think that she was murdered, and I think that Bobby Kennedy probably played some part in it, or just the Kennedys in general. And if he didn't commit the murder himself, I definitely think that he put Dr. Ralph Brinson up to it. Lindsay?
Okay, so since you think the murder was staged, do you think that maybe the people protecting Bobby Kennedy has something to do with staging it?
Yes, I really do, especially Eunice Murray, because she changed her story like several times, and especially when she came back in 1985 and was saying all of that. Corbin?
Your presentation was more based on conspiracy than anything, so what exactly is the validity of it?
Great question. I think that the validity kind of roots from the eyewitness accounts because, especially Peter Lawford, like when I first mentioned the missing tapes, I said that Ray Strait heard them, but who is Ray Strait to you? I mean, nobody really knows him, but when I said that Peter Lawford has also heard the tapes, it was like, oh, okay, maybe actually, because people actually know who Peter Lawford is. So, Nate?
Why do you think Ralph Greenson would have helped them murder if he was so low?
Because, I don't know if you heard me say, but I think because Peter Lawford said that Bobby Kennedy was trying to convince Greenson that she was also going to leak their affair too, which she never had threatened that before. So, yeah.
After Peter Lawford told his versions of the night of Marilyn's death, you said that only a year later he was dead. Do you know exactly how he died?
Yeah, I looked that up and it said he died the next year on Christmas Eve from cardiac arrest. I just think I find it really odd that he was dead only a year after telling her what really happened. Yeah.
Why did you choose this topic?
I think I chose this topic more so because, as I said in my introduction, not a lot of people know who Marilyn Monroe was. And I think that our generation today has really lost the sense of respect that they had for her back in the 20th century. And I just find her death extremely interesting. So, Ms. Norton.
Your thesis?
Yes, ma'am. Although her death was ruled a probable suicide, her secret love affairs, the lack of reliable indications of a suicide, and the eyewitness accounts of her death all point to the probability that she was murdered. Jordan.
Is James Hall still alive?
Good question. I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken. Ms. Gibson?
Okay, my question, and I think I wrote this on your paper too. So why did the police not pursue it?
I'm really not sure. I didn't see that, but I do think that maybe everybody was scared of the Kennedys because, I mean, they are capable of a lot, and I think that had played a big part in it because all of this really didn't show up until after they were both dead, so. Ms. Gibson?
I'm not sure how much you know about the Kennedys, but you know that, of course, John had this reputation for affairs. But did Robert have a reputation for having multiple affairs with his 9 children and Ethel?
I read that he was married and stuff, but I mean, I'm not really sure if he had a reputation for that, but I really think that this affair did happen, so. Corbin?
Was James Hall, the ambulance driver, was his story consistent with the autopsy report? With the broken rib and all that stuff?
Yes, as I recall, yes.
Time is up, actually about a minute and a half past time. As you finish your grading sheets, thank you again.